Red by Ted Hughes. Red was your colour. If not red, then white. But red was what you wrapped around you, blood red. Was it blood? Was it red ochre for warming the dead? Hematite to make immortal the precious heirloom bones, the family bones. When you had your way, finally, our room was red, a judgment chamber, shut casket for gems, the carpet of blood patterned with darkenings, congealments, the curtains ruby corduroy blood, sheer blood falls from ceiling to floor. The cushions the same raw carmine along the window seat, a throbbing cell, Aztec altar, temple. Only the bookshelves escaped into whiteness, and outside the window, poppies thin and wrinkle frail as the skin on blood, salvias that your father named you after, like blood lobbing from the gash, and roses, the heart's last gouts, catastrophic, arterial, doomed. Your velvet long full skirt a swathe of blood, a lavish burgundy, your lips a dipped deep crimson. You revelled in red. I felt it raw like crisp gauze edges of a stiffening wound. I could touch the open vein in it, the crusted gleam. Everything you painted white, then splashed it with roses, defeated it, leaned over it, dripping roses, weeping roses, and more roses. Then sometimes, among them, a little bluebird. Blue was better for you. Blue was wings. Kingfisher blue silks from San Francisco folded your pregnancy in crucible caresses. Blue was your kindly spirit, not a ghoul, but electrified, a guardian, thoughtful. In the pit of red, you hid from the bone clinic whiteness, but the jewel you lost was blue. Okay, so in my analysis of this poem, I will split it into two sections, ending just here after the first one, and then the second one will deal with the remainder of the poem. And then I will conclude with a final broader analysis section on the title, Red, the significance, and the colour itself. Okay, just something to note before I start this poem. This is the final poem of Hughes's Birthday Letters anthology, which was his final anthology. In fact, it was written in 1998, a year before Hughes sadly died. So it's important to note that this is sort of his final statement about his relationship with Plath, which is the major concern of this anthology. He starts by saying red. He echoes the title immediately, and we'll see red come up a lot of times. I'm not even going to underline the amount of times it comes up, but this continual repetition of the idea of red hammers it in. He doesn't use variation that much. He starts to use different shades of red, but really he just reuses this short, punchy word. Red was your colour, this sort of personal pronoun that then Hughes again repeats a lot. He uses you a lot. He doesn't use her name. He uses you, your, and so many more examples. And this almost gives it a sort of accusatory tone, which we see particularly down here. But actually, this red was your colour, the first line, marked by that end stop immediately, creating a very short, truncated line, is actually sort of a mirroring of Plath's own letter that she wrote 2 months before she unfortunately killed herself. And she said that blue is my new colour. So this is what Plath said, I think in a letter to her mother, Aurelia, 2 months before her suicide. And she said, blue is my new colour. So yeah, you can see red was your colour. And again, that's sort of trying to impose this colour on Plath. But then actually we learned that if not red, then white. So Plath is sort of divided, separated by two extremes. And these extremes are represented by Hughes by the colour of red and white. But red, sort of left on its own at the end of the line. Was what you wrapped around you. Was what you wrapped around you. This harsh alliteration, again adding into this sort of accusatory tone that Hughes tries to match. Blood, red, compound, lots of compound words, stylistic of Hughes. Again, a fusion of ideas. This time he's fusing the idea of blood. And this is going to launch into a sort of tumultuous undercurrent of ideas of violence and pain that is just introduced just 4 lines in. Blood, red. But then he questions himself. There's a sort of narratorial uncertainty even with Hughes. He hasn't made up his mind if this red that he attributes to Plath, was it blood red? Or was it a red for warming the dead? Was it red ochre for warming the dead? And you've got this quite ritual rhyme here of red and dead. And the idea of ritual, we'll see, gets carried on through. So all the way up here again was what you wrapped around you. The choice of word for wrap suggests an element of comfort, suggests a symbol of sort of self-inducing, as if Plath has brought her suffering upon herself. So is he saying it was a form of comfort, actually, this red for Plath? Or is he trying to say that it's self-inducing, and therefore is he sort of villainising Plath in doing so by saying that she was the cause for her own downfall? She wrapped it around her intentionally. And then for warming the dead, hematite, which was a sort of a mineral, to make immortal the precious heirloom bones, the family bones. So we've got this hematite, and then we've got this red ochre, which was yet another blood red thing, and this was particularly used for rituals, and it had been used for rituals since Paleolithic times. And it was also used, hematite as a mineral was also used in things of rituals and healings. So just the connotations of these choices of words have these idea of rituals. And then of course this concludes itself with heirloom bones, family bones, like something that's been passed down. And yeah, again, bones, repetition. Hughes likes to use repetition in this poem, as we'll find out. And the family bones, essentially, and this is an idea that is pointed out by Armitage, critic Armitage. So yes, credit to critic Armitage for noting that Hughes questions whether Plath's preoccupation with red was actually connected with the worship of her dead father. And Hughes then goes on to catalogue the red furnishings in his and Plath's house. So he suddenly goes from this idea of family to then something a little bit more personal. He sort of realises, grounds his poem in reality with the room idea, grounded in reality. And this is a reference actually to their Devon home in Court Green. And so this room was actually red. So he hasn't just made this up in a way. So we then go into our second stanza, something that is chiefly about their marriage. And we kind of get this in this idea of a judgment chamber. And a judgment chamber suggests that they sort of judged each other in a relationship. It was a cause of pain, their judgment of each other. But also, was it something that Plath was judging Hughes as a character? Was Plath judging Hughes to be a certain person? Perhaps a judgment of Hughes's character to be Otto. And we can see this picked up later in this stanza. And also this finally is almost reflects the meaning of where it's placed. It is at the end of the line. This accusatory tone, when you had your way, finally. Our room makes it sort of personal. It makes it inclusive rather than just you. Was red. Room was red. Alliteration. A judgment chamber. He just makes a very short sentence. And a chamber suggests something that's sort of locked, shut away. And there we are, shut. It's locked. It's inaccessible. It's a shut casket for gems. And What is the effect of this idea of judgment? Well, it also gives another idea to the colour of red as being a colour of retribution, colour of vengeance. And then gems, this potential idea of hope that we get, but then immediately is locked away with that shut, placed right at the start of that line. The carpet of blood, this is the literal carpet, patterned with darkenings, congealments, and he's getting into his plural words here, that just shows the extent of it. The curtains, and sorry, just picking up on congealments, it suggests a lack of movement, a stasis, something as if it's stuck. The curtains, ruby corduroy blood, sheer blood falls. He uses a compound, presumably like waterfalls, but for blood falls. From ceiling to floor, we get this horrible image, this image of danger, of vitriol as well. But then perhaps this odd image of passion as well, given that it's in their bedroom. I spelled that right. Sheer blood falls from ceiling to floor. The cushions, the same, more pluralization. The same. Repetition again. Raw carmine. Carmine is yet another shade of red. It's sort of a vivid crimson. And this idea of raw blood, sort of organic, natural, common theme so far. Along the window seat, this is another compound word which uses presumably the chair by the window, is what he's saying. And then this fascinating choice of a throbbing cell. Throbbing being a sort of continuous participle, which gives it a sense of vividness, aliveness, even though, of course, it isn't alive at all. Aliveness is the word, sorry. But cell, I want to pick up on this. Obviously, I get the connotations of prison, but could it be something more religious, linking back to these ideas earlier? Could it be like maybe a convent? Or could it even be like a blood cell, a sort of biological reference here? So it could be all of these things put in one. And this is an idea that is picked up on by critic Hyman, in her analysis of this. And then to put in another critic, the whole idea of ritual, which kind of is established with some of these words up here, begins at the very beginning of the poem. Plath's actions are associated with bloody rituals and magic, and we're going to find particularly down here with an Aztec altar and temple that actually it creates a sense of almost demonic possession. And this is critic Skia's idea, that she basically says that because of all this spiritual ritualized imagery, that it's almost as if she's demonically possessed. Aztec altar. Now, Aztec, it's important to point out this word, so the Aztecs, what they used to do is make human sacrifices by tearing out the hearts of their young children, and in particular to the god of the sun. I can't remember his full name. And this is quite consistent with Hughes's identification of Otto as a sort of a god, and Otto with the sun in general. And the effect of this is to create the idea of a blood sacrifice. Is Plath a blood sacrifice just to be reunited with her father? Is she ending her life to be reunited with her father? And this is not an unusual idea in the Birthday-Death anthology. But we know for sure that Plath idolised her father. This idea of a temple, this divine connotations, well, in her poem Daddy, Plath called Otto a bag full of God. So she definitely looked up to him a lot, again, with these divine connotations. So essentially, this blood sacrifice reunites her, but also consumes her identity and her history. So it's a very powerful image, metaphor of an Aztec altar and a temple to describe the room. And again, Armitage, who I mentioned up here with the idea of worship, really draws on some of these ideas in this bit. And then we get a fascinating structural isolation. Just looking at the form of the poem in general, it's very erratic, random, fluid, and the form perhaps suggests the fluidity of Hughes's thought. And it gives a sense of natural quality to the poem, which isn't unusual for the Berthic letters. But then we suddenly have this very rare, which is shown with the word only. It's sort of an exception almost of all this blood red thing that's just been catalogued. But then suddenly only the bookshelves escaped into whiteness. And this idea of escape and bookshelves suggests that poetry is an escape, that it is her writing and Hughes's writing as well, more strikingly, that allows them to escape it from their reality of red into whiteness. And here we are, this colour comes in. And in my broader analysis of the poem, I will be exploring the significance of this colour. So, I will come back to this. But again, this general structural isolation of the line, which creates a remission from this sort of claustrophobic, shut casket, this crimson chamber, and it sort of creates a remission. This is an idea that Hyman builds on as well. And then we've got, and outside, again, this idea of escape, a window. A window suggests another layer, a different layer of reality. He's trying to distance himself. Hughes is trying to distance himself from all this, from this redness by looking outside the window. And he notes poppies. I'm just going to jump ahead to the next flower, salvias and roses, which are all placed emphatically at the start of the line. Poppies, thin and wrinkle frail. Thin, wrinkle, assonance. In his language, in his diction in this poem, Hughes has used a lot of these techniques to move it on. Thin and wrinkle frail, compound word. As the skin, simile on blood. There we are, straight back to it. A second of hope, Hughes gets drawn back in, he gets sucked back in to blood. To the bloody imagery that has bled through this poem so far. Salvias, that your father named after you. Salvia, that's where he claims the names come from, so a bit of insight. Again, another simile here. He uses a dual simile. Like blood, lobbing from the gash. Lobbing, this choice of vocabulary here. Again, throbbing, lobbing. It's a bit like throbbing above. It's these continuous participles. From the gash. Gash, just the oral quality of that word evokes a sense of tension, a tightness that is repeated with gants, the alliterative end of line. And roses, I'm going to come back to the flowers. The heart's last gouts, something final. Catastrophic, arterial, doomed. Obviously, the arteria is referring to the arteries, which creates a sense of sort of life, as if blood is pumping through the body. And this is, of course, a big contrast with the general theme of death in the poem. And we call something, when it's a list of three, a tricolon. But because there's no and to link it, it's asyndeton. So that's sort of the technical term for this structure, which Hughes uses at the end of this stanza. So, poppies. Poppies are sort of linked to hallucinogenic drugs, really, things like opium and heroin. So actually, whilst we have this facade of perhaps something nice and escape, it's actually got some much darker connotations. Salvias, again, to their hallucinogenic quality, their properties. And actually, roses, we could say that sort of metaphorically they are beautiful. However, they are deceptively dangerous. And this is perhaps shown with the words last gouts, arterial, doomed, and then that end stop at the end just completely reflecting the doomed. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of end stops in the poem. And I haven't really commented as much on these medial caesurae, but there are a lot of these as well that in the middle of the sentence, and they just change and completely break apart the structure of the poem. You had this with this dash here with temple, and again with, where was it? It was another example. Curtains, that's it. Curtains. Your velvet long full skirt a swathe of blood, a lavish burgundy, your lips, a dipped deep crimson. This dental alliteration is what we call it. Gives a harsh quality to it. But then your, again, both places at the start of the line, accusatory. And then actually this idea of a long, lavish and lips, labial alliteration this time, which of course links it to the idea of lips. Long, lavish lips, a long, full skirt. And it's this idea of something more passionate, perhaps something more sensual that Hughes introduces, which is really quite out of place with the overall horror of the poem so far. And Hughes's choice of dressing Plath with red perhaps shows that her psychological drama actually begins to consume her identity. And this is a point picked up on by Armitage. Psychological drama starts to become part of her identity, this idea of red. So again, credit to Armitage here. And that ends the first section of my analysis. The next stanza starts with a alliterative phrase, "You revelled in red," which continues the alliteration of the R, rhotic alliteration. You revelled in red. And then again, you, such a short little sentence, little accusation. And he's almost making it seem like Plath enjoys being in red, again, sort of villainising her in self-inflicting this upon her. I felt it raw. So we've got this contrast here. You versus I felt it raw. And critic Hyman points out that actually Hughes's response to this red is a fascination. But this even reaches to a pained awareness. It is painful. And this is continued with the idea of a wound. Like crisp gauze edges. Raw gauze. Assonance linking it together. Like, I felt it raw, and then this medial caesura. Like crisp gauze edges of a stiffening wound. Again, is this wound something that's been opened up by Otto's death? Where's this wound from? Begs the question. But then I could touch. Isolation of touch. Is it a sense of pity that he feels? That he feels? I felt it. I could touch. Is there some pity in Hughes? And this will particularly be built up near the end. The open vein. It's something that will never close. That it's like a shut casket, as mentioned earlier. In it, the crusted gleam. And just the owl quality of these words, really clinging and tight, taut. Everything you painted white. The idea of painting, when I first read this, I thought it meant literal drawing, which it could do, but I think it's something more poetic, her poetic creation. And then white comes back in it. We had it once earlier, but now it fully comes back in. And I say fully, but not quite, because Plath is seeking a sort of solace in the colour white, a reason to live, some ration. But then we find that she can't find it because it's splashed with roses. This idea of painting continued through. Defeated it, is completely defeated. Leaned over it, dripping roses, weeping roses, and more roses. Repetition. No variation at all, just roses. He wants us to focus on his overwhelming emotion that's led to this stream of this repetition. Then, sometimes, he likes using these little indicative words, these temporal words to show, sometimes or everything, or earlier I think we had only. Among them, a little, something small, something fragile. Bluebird. And actually, the bluebird represents this idea of flight that's continued through with the wings, really. But it represents an idea of flight, an idea of freedom, and an idea of escape. And then he just isolates that on the end of that stanza and carries it through. And now we see in the poem a massive tonal shift. It goes from sort of dark to melancholy in this end section. We've got a melancholic tone that you can attribute to this section. He's saying that blue was better for you. It's a bit like this sort of assumption that he had at the start, that red was your colour. And now he's saying that blue was better for you, that blue was wings. And it's almost as if that it is this blue that has enabled Hughes to endure her spirits of red. It's this blue that was not only better for Plath, but also better for Hughes. And this better makes it almost sound like it's got a medicinal quality to it. That was better for you. That was a sort of balm, a healing balm. But then he also says blue was wings. Kingfisher blue silks from San Francisco. We get these quite foreign ideas of a kingfisher and a silk. And San Francisco. But then suddenly folded your pregnancy. Really interesting way of describing what Plath wore when she was pregnant. She wore blue. And actually, this idea of pregnancy, I found a really helpful quote by critic Hyman, who comes up a lot in this critical analysis of this poem, that basically said that rather than Plath's death being something that was predestined, fate, which the idea of doomed, which I think we had in the fourth stanza, where was it? Doomed, yes, here we are. Rather than it being something predestined, it's actually something that has been aborted. That fate, the idea of fate, is aborted. And you'll have to bear with Hyman on this idea with pregnancy. Folded your pregnancy in crucible caresses. Crucible caresses. And I think there's some Jungian philosophy, Carl Jung, which links to this, but I can't explore this in enough detail because of the time. And then this idea of pregnancy as well links into her children. Her children being perhaps Nicholas and Frida being something that might have freed her, a liberating force, but of course they didn't. In fact, her children were alive when she killed herself, obviously, and in the room next door. Blue, repeated, blue, 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 starts each sentence, was your kindly spirit. And Hughes sort of prefers, in a way, to remember Plath in this way, as a sort of genial spirit, as a healer, a guardian, but not an open vein or a stiffening wound. So he disregards these previous epithets to something perhaps more light-hearted, I guess. And but electrified, so sort of suggests a contrast. Electrified, a guardian, thoughtful. Blue is considered something that's calm, that's considered, that provides respite from the colour of red, from the insistence of red. In the pit of red, there we are, just as I said. The pit, a pit of despair usually, isn't it? It's a pit of despair, but this time it's a pit of red. And interestingly, we've had this end stop. So it's not thoughtful in the pit of red. And also, by the way, this is another asyndetric tricolon. We've got a list of three, a bit like we had with that, catastrophized, arterial and doomed. Catastrophic, I think it was. And then also, the connotations of electrified, perhaps her ECT therapy, which was supposed to help her but didn't. And again, guardian as something more spiritual. Sorry, forgot to pick up on this. And then in the pit of red, you hid from the bone clinic whiteness. And then whiteness again. Whiteness is emblematic of peace and purity. But then I'd like to pick on this idea of bone clinic. It's almost as if Plath is hiding from this physical pain with an emotional pain. And then here we are, the line to end all poems. But the jewel you lost was blue. You lost. He can't let go of that idea of you. And then actually, a critic, Sugg, who wrote on the alchemy used in this poem that I'll touch on at the end, noted that what could this jewel perhaps be a reference to childhood, to her own childhood that she really held on to, but then suddenly lost when she killed herself. And then was blue. Blue. And then I'd also like to pick up on another critic, who I also haven't mentioned, called Bundtzen. And Bundtzen says that in this final line, Hughes bids a farewell to Plath with tenderness, with regret, instead of rage, accusation, red, which a lot of Plath's verse actually tends to be filled with. It's a tone of regret. And actually Hughes doubles the loss in this final line, because he knows that she was a jewel that he failed to save. A jewel that Hughes himself failed to save, something precious, this idea of a gem in a shut casket that we had earlier. And Hughes has been haunted by Plath for 30 years. This is his final anthology, and this is how he ends not only his anthology, but all of his poetry. So I'm going to end this poem and really end this series on the anthology with the significance of the colour red, and also the other colours explored in this poem, which are white and blue, but with a particular focus on red. So, which of course takes the title, a very simple, probably the most simple of all his titles in the anthology. Hughes was tasked, obviously, with having a final poem. He knew this would be something important. In fact, after he finished writing birthday letters, he said that he felt the sensation of inner liberation. Hughes described it as inner liberation, that a huge, sudden possibility of new inner experience was found in his final poem. He says that the final poem stands there, that it's something that's permanent, but also vivid and peaceful. Interesting, these are all Hughes' words that I'm quoting, that he said after he'd finished his birthday letters, in letters, I think. So why? This begs the question, why would he then write a poem about, loss, sorrow, regret, blood, anger, all the things that red comes to represent? Death, wounds, judgment, sacrifice, everything like that. And Ted also says that he wanted to end his poem in an upbeat mood. So at many points, this poem seems far from it. They're all Ted Hughes' things to describe his final poem. And indeed, this is a poem of imbalance. This is established right from the start with this idea of white being introduced early on, in the early stages. But it is also a poem of emotional catharsis, a purging of Hughes's emotions, Hughes's way of releasing them. And emotions represent colours, or colours represent emotions in this poem. And I've missed out intentionally a lot of metatextual references that could be made to other of Hughes's poems and Plath's poems of the colours of red, white and blue, because there are just simply too many to be named. But there are some, and I would beg you to look at them. So yeah, red we've touched on a lot, really. Red, as a colour itself, has connotations of passion, has connotations of sacrifice, and of course it has connotations of mental illness, something that I touched on a bit less, but obviously something that affected Plath enormously. And then also the idea that it's associated with vitality, so as well as being associated with death, which I'll add to the list, it's also associated with rebirth, not necessarily with life, but with a rebirth that can be attributed to Plath. And this is picked up on particularly by Armitage in his analysis of the poem, so credit to him for this idea. But red is also about the dynamics between Ted and Plath, between Hughes and Plath, which is explored particularly in the second stanza. So it is a poem of relational dynamics. But red is also a poem of victimizing. It's a victimization of Plath. Plath is the real victim of suicide, of her red anger. Plath is the victim. Hughes also vicariously becomes a victim, but Plath's the ultimate victim. White symbolizes order, and blue, optimism. This is what I got from it. There are so many things that, blue could also be given hope. White could be given this idea of sense that the red fails to touch on. Blue could also be innocence. And both of these could actually be purity, both white and blue. White's typically associated with it, but blue could also be purity. So yeah, that's something important to note. I think someone out there has noted that the red, white and blue are the colours of the American flag, which of course is a nod at Plath's heritage, but I think this could perhaps be a bit of a stretch, but it is something to note. So the idea of the colours of the US flag. And then we've also got the idea of Hughes's own depiction of Plath's writings as bloody and red. So Hughes's own view of it is a means of bringing the dead back to life. Red is a way of doing this in his poetry, which is shown with this line earlier, family bones, wherever that was, family bones, here. And blue is also associated with an idea of death and life, but in a different way, in a way of grief and mourning. So blue could also have this sense of grief and mourning. And really, if we go back to this idea of pregnancy, blue was a colour associated with Madonna, with the Madonna figure, this sort of Christ-like figure that Plath is being associated with, or rather, the Virgin Mary. And something that's also important to note in this poem is that the poem Red, relies heavily on alchemical and psychological imagery. So there's a lot of alchemy hidden into it. And again, I won't go into the full details. But in alchemy, red is the idea of blood and affectivity, and blue is the idea of the mind and the spirit. And there are lots of examples in this poem, again, if you go into this niche analysis of alchemy. So, and that is particularly touched on by critic Sugg. So we are told that both red and white are Plath's favourite colours, but she actually hides herself from the white with the red. And in Plath's own writing, in her poem The Magi poem, white becomes the good and the true. So just a reference. And another poem, which I think was The Moon and the Yew Tree, blue is something that's actually quite cold, but also something that's electrified. So yeah, we can see that as well with Plath's own poetry. And what we can also note is that the fact that Hughes paints this all-red world that Plath inhabits before her suicide is different to the way that her dying is presented. So dying in red does not mean dying in vain. I'll say that again. This is something that Sugg points out again. It is not in vain. And this really reminds me of the epitaph that Hughes commissioned to be on Plath's tombstone, which reads, "Even amidst the fierce flames, the golden lotus can be planted." And a lotus symbolised purity and enlightenment, which perhaps suggests a hope of rebirth. But yet, even on Plath's own epitaph, which this line almost seems like it should belong to in a way, there is this idea of hope amidst suffering, hope amidst the bleak red that perpetuates Hughes's final poem. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope my analysis and that of other critics was helpful in exploring this poem.